Okay, we're still at Hammon, and we have talked about several things, stories and this type of thing. I'd like to get back a little bit to the church. We decided we were going to try to put together a brotherhood, and it became we wanted it to be more than just a meet and eat type thing, and so our men began to come together, and one of the things that we did to try to encourage participation, I got some rib bones off of a cow and sawed them in chunks, about an inch long. They made about an inch wide, and we would use these. Each man was given one, and he was to carry it. If he got caught without it, it cost a quarter. And so a lot of interest in this, and the men got a kick out of it. We made some trips. One time we went to Dodge City, Kansas, and visited the old Front Street there. And of course, my folks lived 20 miles south of there, so we stayed at their place, and I had a meal or two there. But we visited the old Front Street, and the old they used to have an old longhorn cow made out of concrete, and just a lot of stuff like that. And it was an interesting time for our men. But one of the things that developed out of this, out of our brotherhood, I began to notice that after our meeting was over, the old men had sat around and they'd begin to tell stories. And a lot of these were old legends and things that were just really interesting. So I told them, I said, guys, I said, we need to, instead of saving these till our meeting is over and part of our guys are gone and whatever, I said, we ought to, you guys ought to tell a story. One of you ought to tell a story every meeting that we have. And so they began to do this. And we had a fellow by the name of Immanuel Miles. And Immanuel was telling a story one night, and man, it was such a neat story, and I saw so many Christian principles involved in it that I have told this story. I've used it in Royal Ambassador camps and youth camps and things, around campfires, and it's such a rich story. Immanuel told this story, and let me share it with you because it's a neat story. There was a young Cheyenne brave that was moving from or going from western Oklahoma, where the Cheyennes were, over to Ute country in the southwest corner of Colorado, Utah, in that area. And it was before the day of horses, and where he had to walk. And so as he made preparation, he made several pairs of moccasins, and he began to get together some dry meat and make preparation for his trip. And he started out And as he would travel all day long. He would, if he found something or was able to kill something, he would take it with him, and when he came evening, he'd try to find a creek with some wood and water, and he would spend the night and cook whatever he found, and then the next day go on his way. And so he'd been doing this for quite a while, and he was clear over in the Colorado area, and had killed something that day, and found a nice creek and plenty of wood, and so he built a fire and cooked his meat, and it was beginning to get dark, and as he was making preparation to eat, there was a voice came out of the darkness, and it said, "I'm hungry, share with me." Well, this is typical of Indian people. He said, "Yeah, come on in, and there's enough." And but the boy said, "No, just throw it out into the darkness, and I'll eat it out here." And this kind of bothered him a little bit, but he threw some meat out. But at the same time, he built his fire up a little bigger, and he could hear the sound as he ate. He could hear the sound of whatever this was out there in the darkness, eating as well. And so after they had completed their eating, the boy said, "Let's make some sport. Let's wrestle." And he wasn't really interested in this because he couldn't figure out what was out there in the darkness. But finally he agreed, and he threw some more wood on the fire, and the fire began to build up. And then he could see what was out in the darkness, and what was out there was a skeleton. And so, boy, he began to wrestle with this skeleton, and it didn't take him very long to realize that as long as that skeleton was out in the darkness, it was really strong. But if he got closer to the light, he was stronger. And so in just a little bit, he maneuvered close to the fire, and he threw the skeleton. And the skeleton got up from the ground, and he said, "You fought well. You've won your life." Well, needless to say, he didn't sleep anymore that night. The skeleton disappeared. He went on into Ute country, and there was a young Ute that was getting ready to come back to Cheyenne country. And he got him off the side, and he said, "Now, when you come to this certain place," he said, "you want to really build that fire up big, because," he said, "that skeleton is really strong." And the young Ute just laughed at him and went on. And so, sure enough, the Ute boy went on his journey, and he got to this place, and he built him a little fire and began to cook his meat. And sure enough, the voice out in the darkness asked him for something to eat, so he threw some out there. And after they'd done eating, the voice suggested some wrestling, and he said, "Sure." He said, "I can take you." And he didn't build his fire up. And it didn't take him very long to realize that this skeleton was strong. And in just a little bit, the skeleton threw him in the darkness. When the skeleton got up off of him, he said, "You have fought poorly. You have forfeited your life. When the new moon comes, you'll die." Well, needless to say, he didn't sleep anymore that night either. But instead of going on to Cheyenne country, he turned around and he went back to his home, and he began to give away his possessions and make preparation for his death. And sure enough, when the new moon came, he died. And as Immanuel shared this story, I thought, man, look at the spiritual application to this. That skeleton is Satan. Mm-hmm. That fire is Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. You as a young person are that brave. Now, if you'll stay close to Jesus, you can overcome Satan. But you get out in the darkness away from him, and Satan will throw you every time. And I have shared that story for the last 50 years.
That's a good story.
And I've got a lot of books, and I've read a lot of books on Indian, on Cheyenne legends and things, and I have never found this story in any of the books. And but Immanuel shared that night, and it was just such a precious thing. And like I said, I've told it again and again and again. Get in Royal Ambassador camps, and the boys that have been there in years past says, Brother Heiney, tell us about the skeleton.
That's such a good story.
And this came out of our men's meetings, and that was such a rich experience. We had a county extension agent come to our church one time, and he was trying to work with our Indian people, and especially with our ladies, and he was teaching them how to utilize commodities. He had a little booklet, and Deloris and I have used it over the years. It's a master mix made out of commodity flour and baking powder and all this type of stuff, and really what it makes is Bisquick, and it told how to make cakes and cookies and pancakes and everything in the world out of master mix, and that county extension agent was the one that taught our Indian people how to do that. Deloris and I was laughing the other day. She got a book from not a book, but a brochure from Bisquick that was telling all of the different things you could make out of Bisquick. And I told her, I laughed and said, you know what, that extension agent was about 40 years ahead of them. And
sure was.
But you know, we worked any possible way we could. We used government programs. We used they had a Red Moon Bead Club, which was a bunch of our ladies that got together once a week for 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon and sat around and did beadwork, and taught Deloris how to do beadwork. Deloris has made moccasins and done all kinds of beadwork. In fact, she taught one of our ladies over at Sharp's Corner how to do beadwork, and now that lady will not confess that Deloris taught her, but she does spectacular work, and but that all come back to the Red Moon Bead Club. These ladies, I don't remember what the occasion was, but we were having some kind of a meeting at the church, dedication or something, and I noticed that several of the women were out in a car and frantically working, and at the close of the service they presented me with a pair of beaded moccasins, but they have worked clear through this meeting.
Wow.
getting it ready. But this we did whatever we could working with the people to try to teach them, but to glean and to use their culture and their way of life to touch their lives. There was an old woman. All we knew her by was Woosie. Woosie became a real close friend of Deloris's. She was an older woman, and Deloris remembers that she had a chair similar to one of these rockers, only it wasn't a rocking chair. It was just a stuffed chair, and she has seen Woosie sitting cross-legged up in the seat with a bucket down on the floor and bending down and washing her clothes sitting in this chair. And when Lucy passed away, we were talking to her, some of her family, and she told them, Lucy had a little pen, a little green pen, I think it was green, a little beaded pen, and Deloris said, I'd like to have something to remember Lucy by, some little thing that, and so here they came. You see that pipe up there on the wall?
Yeah.
With that tobacco pouch?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
They brought that was her personal pipe, and they gave it to Deloris. Toby said, some of our kids will get a hold of that and they'll take it and hawk it for nothing, and it'll be something to drink and whatever, and said, we're going to give it to you. Lucy would want you to have it. So we were given that pipe. And the same thing happened to me one day. Another older man, old Henry white man, had passed away, and I remember Henry and some of these. There's about 4 or 5 of these old Indian men. I'd be down at Albert Flint's grocery store, and across the street there was a building that was vacated, and there'd be 3 or 4 of these old men sitting over there, and they sat down on their feet, on their haunches, back, just squatted, and sit there and talk and use their hands in sign language with one another by the hour. And when old Henry passed away, I went out to the cemetery. They were digging his grave out there, and gosh, he was. It was cold. It was probably 15, 20 degrees with about a 40-mile-an-hour wind blowing out of the north, and these guys were sitting in the car warming up from digging the grave, and I crawled in the back seat of their car with them and was sitting there visiting with them, and there was a cane that old Henry had. I'd seen him use it again and again and again, and it was just 3/4 inch round, not very big, and it had a handle that kind of sloped on it that was dark, and come to find out, it was a limb off of a willow, where apparently it must have been 3 or 4 inches across, but they'd cut this off and the limb come up, so they turned it over and cut down to where just the heart. So you get a hold of the heartwood, and there's your handle. I've got that cane. But anyway, as I was sitting there visiting with them, they said, I mentioned something about him, and Toby reached down there and picked up his cane. It was laying there in the back seat, and he said, "Preacher, why don't you take that?" He said, "We're just going to burn this. We're going to burn all of his stuff. And but why don't you take this, and you can have this?" And so I've still got that cane.
Wow.
And let's see. Lawrence was, as I said, Lawrence was born while we were at Hammon, and I guess he was 2 or 3 years old when this incident happened. And we were at church one night and had some kind of a Bible study, and we got ready to go home, and Lawrence was missing. Couldn't find him anywhere. Went through the whole church, and he had had the history of being his own boy, and like one time he was a little bit older when this incident happened, but his mother was giving him fits, and so she heard the back door slam, and she looked out the window, and he was just trudging just as fast as he could back down toward one of the Indian neighbor friends, and she walked to the door and she said, "Lawrence Heiney, where are you going?" And he says, "I is going down to Emma's to give you some pieces of quiet." And he was always, well, anyway, we couldn't find him at the church, and so we went home, or sent somebody down at the house. It wasn't at the house. There was a basketball game at the school a couple of blocks away. We went down there and looked. We couldn't find him anywhere. And finally, we went back to the church, and I went into my study, and when I came out of my study, there was an arm laying out of the back of my pulpit. He had crawled into the back of the pulpit and gone to sleep, and was sound asleep. And we had looked all over that town for him, and we'd turned the lights off, locked church up and everything, and he'd slept right on through. And if he hadn't flopped the arm out, I don't know when we would have found him. And it's just an interesting thing. Mm-hmm. In that, we built and dedicated that church in Hammon. My father, who was a blacksmith in Mineola, Kansas, built the steel baptistry for that, and so we had it in. He made it out of iron and made a channel down with where you could put glass in the front of it to where you could actually see part of the baptism through the glass, and then later when we built one at Pine Ridge, we built the baptistry for it as well. But let's see here. we had while we were like I said, we did anything we could with our church to try to reach out and touch people's lives. We had one year we had a fall revival roundup, and we got a chuck wagon, and DeWitt Hawkins come over and sung and played on his guitar, and we had a big winter roast and cookout off of the back of that, and played games and three-legged races and all this type of thing out in the lot south of our church building, and we just the people really put a lot of time and effort into it, and we were able to reach a good number of people through this roundup revival that we had. We had while we were there, we had an old man by the name of Rem Turtle. Rem was an old Cheyenne. He was well over 90 years old and couldn't understand nor speak a word of English. But that old man was faithful to the church. He came every time we had a meeting, and he sat on the very back on the left-hand side, right beside the center pew, right at the end of the pew, but the center walkway. And he was there every service, and he could not understand one word of what I said. And we had kind of a smart alecky older man there, and one day he was talking in Sioux to Rem, and he said, Rem, he said, why in the world do you even come to church? Said, you can't understand Brother Heiney? You don't know what's going on? Why do you even come? And he told me that old Rem told him, he said, God is here, and I am here, and that's all that matters. I thought, man, you talk about a sermon.
Yeah.
And when old Rem died, man, for the longest time, I looked back there when I was preaching at that empty spot that he left. You know, it was just he was just such a neat old man, and it was. We had a lot of experiences during that time. One evening, one night, in the middle of the night, one of the ladies, Emma Hallingwater, came up. She said, Brother Heiney, come quick. There's a couple of boys down at the intersection by my house that got knives, and they're fighting. And so I got up and went down, and I got to talking to the guys, and before it was all over, I had both of their knives, and they were walking off together.
Wow.
I talked them out of
Wow.
it. But there was just a lot of experiences that we had while we were there. This was probably, if there ever was a honeymoon church, this one probably was. We ran, we had our own vacation Bible schools. Everybody did their own teaching. We'd average 50, 55 in our Bible schools. we dedicated our building, as I said, in March of '60. But we decided that the association and the First Baptist Church and the Indian Mission decided they were going to build a parsonage. And they built a 3-bedroom brick parsonage, a monster, 3 bedrooms, and did this on May the 30th, dedicated on May the 30th, 1965. It was a beautiful, beautiful building, and had ceramic tile bathrooms, and I did the ceramic work in that, and it was a beautiful thing. And we had that in, as I said, we dedicated that in '65, and within the next year or two, we're going to find us leaving that parsonage and going to Havre, Montana. But we did study course books. We did in '66. We had 16 people receive credit for the Book of John study course, and that year we took 12 of our young people went to Indian Falls Creek, and we even had a World Mission Conference in our church. Not us going somewhere, but in our church, and we had Irvin Green from Africa and we averaged 53 people a night to hear our different missionaries. And it was during this time that the Lord began to bring our work to a close in Hammon. It was during this very School of Missions. There was a missionary from Montana, Leroy Smith. He was presenting the needs in Havre, Montana for a missionary. They had a U.S. 2 couple who were serving there for 2 years. This was a program where they had been going to seminary for a while, and they could sign up for this U.S. 2 program and spend 2 years on a mission field, then go back for a short term at the seminary, and then be appointed as missionaries, foreign missionaries. And this is where Johnny and Diana can't get a name.
Johnny Norwood?
Yeah, Johnny and Diana Norwood, where they were serving, and Leroy was talking about this need of a pastor for Havre, and I was it was in a joint meeting, a day meeting, and all the missionaries were there, and quite a few lay people, and they were sharing. Leroy was sharing this need, and Laddie Adams, who was the director of Indian Missions at that time, was sitting right in front of me in this meeting, and man, I began to feel in my heart that this is where God wanted us. And I hadn't had a chance to talk to Delo. I hadn't. It was just out of the clear blue. But as Leroy talked, I just this thing really got on my heart. And So I just reached up and touched Laddie and motioned for him to come out when Leroy got done, and we went out front of the First Baptist Church there in Sydney, not Sydney, but anyway, there in Oklahoma. And I told him, I said, I've never asked the Home Mission Board to transfer me or to, I've never tried to figure out where God wanted me. I just figured he could always tell me. But when Leroy Smith was talking about the need of Havre, Montana, I said, I feel like that's where we need to go. And I want to know if, I want you to start looking and seeing if you can work with the Home Mission Board in the possibility of a transfer to Havre. And Laddie was a good friend of mine, and he said, Harold, he said, if you got problems or whatever, he said, there's a lot of Indian churches here in Oklahoma where you could go in a heartbeat. And I said, that's not it. He said, well, I'll check into it and see what we might be able to work out. Well, just prior to this, Deloris had commented, we always got a lot of clothing in to share with our Indian people, and it was always under the, everybody always told us that you take what you need out of the mission boxes, and then if there's, you let your people have the rest of them. And she began to comment to me, we had stacks of boxes out in our garage of heavy winter clothes, brand new coats that just fit our 4 kids.
Oh, wow.
Underwear, all of everything you need. And she had made a comment. She didn't know what God was doing, but it looked to her like that maybe it was going to be cold. And Havre, Montana is cold. And but Laddie checked into it, and I talked to Leroy Smith about this as well, and got in contact with Johnny Norwood, and this was along in oh goodness, it was would have been in February or March, and I just felt so strongly, and the Home Mission Board was not really moving on this thing, and but I felt so strongly that and Deloris and I had talked about it and prayed about it, and so I resigned my church at Havre, at Hammon, and still didn't have anything from the Home Mission Board, but I just felt so strongly. Well, I kept trying to contact Johnny, and I couldn't get him in Havre, and I tried to call, I wrote letters, and I was working at a camp among the Seminoles in the eastern part of the state, and the whole family was there. And we had a funeral, and I had to come back for it. And I walked in the house, and the telephone rang, and it was Johnny Norwood. And Johnny was wanting for me to come up and look at the field and see what God might be working. Home Mission Board still hadn't come up with any move on this thing. And so later I found out that in between the time that Johnny, that Leroy Smith had talked down here in Oklahoma, that Art Stacer, an airman, had felt God's call to become the pastor of Havre. And Johnny was leaving, and Art was going to become pastor. And Johnny had taken a month leave and had gone to visit relatives and gone back to school to check there. And he was gone, and Art was going to preach. And when he got back, Art told him, he said, I don't understand what's happening. He said, I'm already retiring out of the Air Force. I've already got this worked out. But he said, I preached the first Sunday you were gone, and he said, I knew that this was not where God wanted me. And he said, I don't know anything. He said, every time I've preached, he said, I become more positive. And Johnny really gave him the third degree. He said, I kept coming back again and again and again. But Art, you felt God's call, and you're coming out of the Air Force. And Art said, I know all of that, but I don't know what it is. And after Johnny had talked to him for a good long time, Johnny took my letter and handed it to Art. And in it, I had indicated that I felt like God was leading me to Havre, Montana. And Art read it, and he said, here's your answer, Johnny. This is the reason God doesn't want me. He said, he wants Harold here. Well, we made arrangements to go up in view of a call, and we left out in a Nash Rambler station wagon, and all of our family and my mother-in-law. And we headed out. We got as far as Dodge City, Kansas, and the transmission went out. And we were 3 days there getting transmission fixed. We come on up through the Black Hills and visited some relatives, and went on north to Williston, North Dakota, and headed across and got to Glendive. Not Glendive. Another town on the Highline, Glasgow, and pulled up at a stop sign, and the transmission went out of the car again. And so we put it in a garage and got a motel. And my mother-in-law was saying every time some little thing would happen, God doesn't want you up here. And that's when I was it just confirmed to me that God wanted us up here, that Satan was doing everything he could possibly do. We went and preached, and the church called us, and we started home, and that car would not go over a mountain. You might go up over it at 5 miles an hour. And I was in every garage that I could, trying to get it worked on, and nobody. We finally got down into Colorado, where my brother lived, and stopped to see him, and started over a pass down there, and we tried all day long. I'd take it in the garage, they'd work on it, and we'd start up that mountain, and there was my precious mother-in-law all of the time. And we got over at just about dark that night. We got over that thing doing 5 miles an hour. We drove into Hammon, Oklahoma, and that car run perfect. I took it to a garage, and the fella could not find one thing wrong with it. And that was what transpired in our calling and going to Havre, Montana, and it was such a neat experience as we labored there, but the call to there was and the getting there was a difficult thing, and we so this concluded our work at Hammon, and we moved to Havre, and while I was in Oklahoma, that last year that I was in Oklahoma, I received the Outstanding Royal Ambassador, Associational Royal Ambassador Leadership Award for the state of Oklahoma, 59 and 60, because of my so much involvement in Royal Ambassador work, and on a state and on an associational level. When I was at Hammon, we would have Brotherhood men and boys steak fries, and we would have 150 men and boys at those steak fries just from our association, and we had a lawyer that used to cook those steaks like I cook fish. Same type of situation. That's where I learned it, and but I was associational Royal Ambassador leader, 59 and 60.